And we have entitled this psalm, What Might Have Been. Now the first 7 verses of this psalm deal with what was. It deals with what God's relationship with Israel was. And Israel here is represented under the term Joseph. When they went into Egypt, when they went down to Egypt and Joseph blessed them by providing them with food, and ultimately they were given the land of Goshen, they evidently became known as Joseph's people, and so the name Joseph was ascribed to all of the tribes. And that's likely the way that the psalmist was using it here. And so Joseph, or Israel, as we know them, they enjoyed great blessings from God. And the psalmist here, Asaph, was the historian. He was the one who so often recounts the history of Israel and talks about what God did for them. And in this psalm, he talks about in the first 7 verses what God has done for them and the fact that they should rejoice and how good God has been to them. Beginning in verse 1, he says, Sing aloud unto God our strength. Make a joyful noise unto the God of Jacob. Take a psalm and bring hither the timbrel, the pleasant harp with a psaltery. Blow up the trumpet in the new moon, in the time appointed on our solemn feast day. For this was a statute for Israel and a law of God of Jacob. And so he begins by mentioning the joy that should be true of them, the joy that they should have as they remember what God has done for them. And so he talks about singing and singing out loud. I'm afraid sometimes we don't express the joy that we ought to. We may sing, but we don't sing out. We don't put a great deal of energy or a great deal of effort or a great deal of volume into what we're doing. And so here they're encouraged to sing aloud, sing out so that others can hear them. If you're not singing in such a way that those around you can hear you, then you have to ask yourself how much teaching and how much admonishing are you really doing? In order to teach, those that you're trying to teach have to be able to hear you. In order to be encouraged, those words have to be spoken so that they can hear them and understand them. And so we need to keep that in mind as we're singing, and the psalmist calls upon them to do that. He talks about the instruments. He talks about the timbrel and the harp and with the psalms. And so all of this was being sung together. We have to keep in mind that this was under the Old Testament system. It was not under the New Testament system. And at least in my judgment, there were things that were allowed under the Old Testament, even met with the approval of God, that would not meet with His approval today, and that are not allowed in New Testament worship. There's some discussion as to whether they were ever allowed under Old Testament worship. It seems to me that they were. But we have to understand that they did not cross the threshold into the new. When God gave the new, God said, sing and make melody in your heart to the Lord. The instrument that we use today is the mouth. It's the strings of the heart that we are playing. We do not use a mechanical instrument of music. There is no justification for that, even if they were allowed in the Old Testament. He talks about the trumpet in verse 3, and that was the shofar. That was the ram's horn that they blew and the announcement of certain things and in the celebration of certain feasts. And they would blow this trumpet, and they would celebrate the new moon and the coming of the new moon, the time appointed on our solemn feast day. Now, the feast days were solemn occasions. They were serious occasions, and yet they were joyous occasions. They were remembrances of good things that God had done for His people. And so, even though they were serious and they had to be done on a certain day, and they had to be done in a certain way, and there was a seriousness because you were approaching God, there also was a great deal of joy that was involved in those feast days, and we see that in these first 4 verses. Now, when we get to verse 5, we begin to recount the history. It's just a small amount of the history, but the language is very beautiful. This He ordained in Joseph. They're called Jacob in verse 1, but here they're called Joseph. This He ordained in Joseph for a testimony when he went out through the land of Egypt, where I heard a language that I understood not. There's some discussion over exactly what's being talked about here The Egyptians, of course, did not speak the same language. They spoke different languages, and so they were in a strange land, and maybe that's what's being referred to here. And they were brought out of that land where a strange language was spoken, and they were brought into a land where their language was spoken. Some also believe that it has reference to the idolatry that was true in Egypt, and the fact that those people were doing things that God did not recognize and that God did not honor. Maybe that's the case. But they get away from that strange land, and they get away from that strange language, and they move into a land where only God is worshipped. They move into a land where their language is spoken. In verse 6, I removed his shoulder from the burden, and his hands were delivered from the pots. The word pots here is generally translated as baskets. It's some type of a vessel. It was a vessel that was used for the carrying of what was the ground or the earth that was used to make the bricks. And the idea here is of this long pole that stretches across both shoulders, and on either end there's a basket that is filled with earth. And they were hauling that to make those bricks. And you can think about the back-breaking kind of work that was. And you can think about how at the end of the day, how your shoulders and how your neck must have ached from carrying that heavy load. And we know that they were beaten. We read of that in the life of Moses as he saw the Israelite being beaten. And so they were mistreated. And they were driven to carry as much as they could possibly carry. And to carry it as fast as they possibly could carry it. It was extremely hard in the service that they were called upon to yield. I don't know if we have anything to compare it to today. This is the illustration, at least, that resonates with me. Have any of you ever done any roofing? Some of you may have roofed a house or something of that nature. And if you've ever had to climb a ladder with shingles on your shoulder, then you know something about carrying a burden. And you know how heavy it is. It's not easy to climb a ladder just by itself. But when you place the shingles on your shoulder and you're trying to climb the ladder with that burden on you, it becomes extremely difficult. And to do that all day, every day, for a living would be very hard. And yet the Israelites were called upon to bear that kind of a burden in Egypt. And we read of that. In fact, the Old Testament captures it. In Exodus chapter 1 and verse 14, we read that there arose a Pharaoh that knew not Joseph, and he was afraid of the Israelites and their growing in number, and the fact that some enemy might come in, and they might join with that enemy, and they might overthrow Egypt. So he decided, we've got to make life hard on them. We've got to make life so hard on them that they won't have any energy to revolt. We've got to make life so hard on them that they won't be reproducing in the same way that they are right now. But it didn't work that way. God continued to bless them. But he says in Exodus 1 and verse 14, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. They made their work as hard as it possibly could be. And so you could see these slaves who are carrying these huge baskets of earth upon their shoulders. The life expectancy of the Israelites as they were being pressed must have been extremely short. They must not have lived very long as they were building the great pyramids and the treasure cities of Egypt. In Exodus chapter 6 and verse 6, it says, wherefore say unto the children of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will rid you of their bondage, and I will redeem you with a stretched out arm and with great judgments. God through Moses says, I'm going to deliver you. I'm going to take that heavy burden off of your backs. I'm going to make life sweeter for you. It's been bitter, but I'm going to make it sweet. I'm going to take care of you. In Psalm 105 and verse 5, the psalmist says, remember his marvelous works that he hath done, his wonders and the judgments of his mouth. And that's what the psalmist is calling upon them to do. He's calling upon them to remember what God has done for them, to remember their history, to remember what was, what God had accomplished. Notice he says in verse 7, thou calledest in trouble and delivered thee, and I delivered thee. I answered thee in the secret place of thunder. I proved thee at the waters of Meribah. And then we have this pause. A pause that's designed for reflection, a pause for us to stop and think about that, to think about what God did for them in the delivering of them from this Egyptian bondage. He answered them in the secret place of thunder, and that no doubt has reference to the plagues that came upon Egypt, simply one being referred to here. But we think about the great power that God demonstrated, and we think about their being proved at the waters of Meribah. And so that's what was. But beginning in verse 8, we have reference to what might have been. And that's really what the thrust of this psalm is. The thrust of this psalm is, here's what your history is. But the rest of this psalm is, here's what your history could have been. I don't know if you've ever thought about it or not, but at least it seems to me that the potential is there for us one day to look back on our lives from the vantage point of heaven, and for us to be able to see what our lives could have been. What our lives could have been if we had maximized our living before God. If we had always listened to Him. If we had always obeyed Him. If we had always taken advantage of the opportunities that were ours. What might have been in our lives. And I think we will be amazed at the struggles that we've had, of the shortages that we've had, of the difficulties that we've had, that we would not have had we simply been what we could have been and what God wanted us to be. And that's what the last part of this psalm is all about, what might have been. Now, John Greenleaf Whittier, the American writer, wrote these words, "For all sad words of tongue and pen, the saddest are these, it might have been." And that is truly the saddest of all. It might have been. Of what could have been true of our lives, of what could have been ours if we had only taken advantage of it. And the psalmist is going to talk about that in reference to Israel's history. Notice beginning in verse 12, he says, "Hear, O my people, and I will testify unto thee. O Israel, if thou wilt hearken unto me." I'm going to tell you, I'm going to testify to you of what life could be. In verse 9, "There shall no strange God be in thee, neither shalt thou worship any strange God." Now, when God envisioned the history of Israel, when God envisioned Israel as a people, when God delivered them from Egyptian bondage, God envisioned a land where there wouldn't be any idols. God envisioned a land where the strange gods of Egypt would never be found. Now, that isn't what happened. We know that the idolatry of the people round about, it was brought into the land. We know that they even made golden calves like they had back in Egypt. But that never was what God wanted. They deviated from God's plan in bringing those things in. And so God says, I'm going to bring you out of this strange land. I'm going to bring you out of a land where a strange language is spoken. I'm going to bring you out of a land where strange gods are worshipped. And I'm going to put you in a land that isn't anything like that. And in this land you can reach your full potential. God says, I'm literally going to till up the soil. I'm going to plant you. I'm going to water it. I'm going to fertilize you. And it's going to be amazing what you can become. That's the image here. But notice he continues. "There shall be no strange God be in thee, neither shalt thou worship any strange God. I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt. Open thy mouth wide, and I will fill it." Open thy mouth wide, and I will fill it. Some commentators suggest that it was the habit of ancient monarchs that when they wanted to honor someone, they would call someone into them, and they would take some sweet delight, and they would ask that individual to open his mouth, and then they would fill his mouth with that sweet delight, whether it be, we might say, some chocolate truffle or something. But something delightful and sweet and wonderful, they would fill his mouth. But some monarchs went beyond that. Some monarchs literally would take rubies and diamonds and all kinds of precious gems, and they would fill his mouth, literally, with those gems. Those were his. And they were honoring him in that way. And so that evidently is the imagery here. And the idea, God says, open your mouth, and open your mouth wide, and I will literally fill your mouth with these blessings. Now, if you knew that someone was going to give you diamonds, and they would give you as many diamonds as your hands could hold. How would you hold your hands? Would you hold them like this? Or would you make them just as wide as you possibly could without anything dropping out of them? But just stretch your hands out to get as much as you possibly could. That's the image here. You might think back to your wedding day, and you might think back to the cake when you were feeding one another a bite of cake, and you think about how wide you opened your mouth. Not only because of joy, because you didn't want to get cake all over your face or whatever it was, but think about opening your mouth. Well, here's the idea here of them opening as wide as they possibly can, because God's going to give a blessing to them, and they want to get as much as they possibly can. And so they're preparing themselves to receive this blessing. God says, you open your mouth wide, and I will fill it. But then we read verse 11. But my people would not hearken to my voice, and Israel would none of me. God said, I told them to open as wide as they could. I would give them, I would literally fill their lives with blessings, but they wouldn't listen to me. They didn't want anything to do with me, God says. They turned away from me. They weren't interested in what I was offering them. Verse 12, so I gave them up into their own heart's lust, and they walked in their own counsels. You know, God offers. God says, I want to give you all of these blessings. But if we refuse, and if we don't want anything to do with Him, God will let us go the way we want to go. God will let us choose the temporal, perishing things of this world over the eternal things that He longs to give us, if that's what we really want. It isn't what He wants for us, but God will honor our free will. God will allow us to make that choice. He won't force us to take blessings that we don't want. He won't force us to serve Him or obey Him. He won't force us. He didn't force Israel. But it's the story of what might have been, of what their lives could have been like had they listened to God, had they chosen the pleasures of heaven over the pleasures of this life like Moses did, and like other great men did. If they had made the choice that Abraham made, to leave father and mother, to leave country, to leave Ur the Chaldees, for the land that God would show him, to find that city that had foundations, whose builder and maker was God. That choice was before them. Abraham chose it, Moses chose it, but in large part the Israelites did not. In large part they turned away, wanted nothing to do with God. They walked in their own lust. But as we continue, think about Ephesians chapter 3 in verses 19 and 20. In this idea of being filled with the fullness of God, it says, and to know the love of Christ which passeth knowledge, that you might be filled with all the fullness of God. Now unto Him that is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that worketh in us. God says to us, open your mouth wide and I will fill it. Open up your heart, open up your life to me, and I will fill your life. I will give you the fullness of what I have if you'll just open up and take it. But we turn away and we don't want anything to do with God. We allow our hearts, our mouths to remain closed. God's not going to force it open. God's not going to force it in. No, we have to make that choice. He wants to, but He allows us to choose. In Psalm 81, in verses 13 through 16, we really get to the heart of this idea of what might have been. And the language becomes extremely beautiful. Notice beginning in verse 13. Oh, that my people had hearkened unto me, and Israel had walked in my ways. Think about that first expression. Oh, that. Oh, that. We find that expression a number of times in the Old Testament, where God says, oh, that Israel, oh, that. It's God thinking about what He wanted to do. God thinking about what their lives could have been like if they had only been open to Him, if they had only been receptive of what He was offering. Notice we continue, and then we'll notice some other verses. Notice in verse 14, I should have subdued their enemies and turned my hand against their adversaries. God said, I wanted to subdue all of their enemies. If you remember in the book of Judges especially, God doesn't anymore deliver them from one enemy to another one arises. It's just over and over and over and over again. God says, I would have subdued all of those enemies for them. They wouldn't have had to deal with any of those things. I would have fought for them, and I would have dealt with every one of those individuals if they had only trusted in me, if they'd only been willing to listen to me. They had those problems because they wouldn't accept what I was offering. He says in verse 15, the haters of the Lord should have submitted themselves unto Him, but their time should have endured forever. God refers to them as haters of the Lord. Now the image is this, and you need to get this point. Jesus said no man can serve two masters. Either he will love the one and hate the other, or else he'll hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon. You see, in our relationship with God, we either love Him or we hate Him. There's no in between. It's one or the other. We love Him or we hate Him. They wouldn't listen to God. They didn't want anything to do with God. What do you call that? Well, the way the Bible defines it, you call that hate. They hated God. If you won't listen to Him, if you don't want anything to do with Him, God says, you hate me. They're haters of God. You don't have to be a person that shakes his fist at heaven. You don't have to be the person that gets out and spouts off what some in the world do against God. No, just turn away from Him. Just don't live for Him. And the Bible says you're a hater of God. Because if you're a lover of God, love for God demands that you keep His commandments. Love for God demands that you do what God's asked you to do. If you do anything less than that, you're a hater of God. That's the way the Bible classes you. You have to understand that. You have to see it in black and white. Now notice he continues. He says that their time should have endured forever. When you think about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, can you not say of them that their time should have endured forever? God put them in that garden, and how long could they have been in that garden? Well, forever if they had obeyed God, right? But when they didn't obey God, their time ended long before it should have. God put Israel in the land of Canaan. God says, this is your land, and if you will obey my commandments, if you will do what I tell you to do, God says this will be your land throughout generations. But if you don't, God made very clear you'll lose this land. Now the fact that Israel holds very little of that land today says nothing about the faithfulness of God. It says everything about their unfaithfulness. 1 Kings 8, verse 56 says, not one word failed of all of His good promise. God gave them the land just as He said He would. But God also kept His promise that if they were not faithful, they would lose that land, and they have lost that land because of their unfaithfulness to God. But God says it could have been theirs forever. It says in verse 16, He should have fed them also with the finest of the wheat, and with honey out of the rock should I have satisfied thee. God says you could have had the finest of the wheat. You could have had honey from a rock. They had water from a rock, but God says you could have had honey from a rock. They had manna, but God said you could have had the finest of wheat. You see, that's what I wanted to give you, God said, but because of your disobedience, you never realized the full blessings that were available to you. You never got the honey from the rock. It could have been yours. Ready and willing to give it to you. But God was proving them. We've already read that in the context. He was proving them with water from a rock. You pass that test, you get honey from a rock. But you fail that test, and you miss out on the blessings that God had in store for you? How many people today miss out on the blessings that God has in store for them? Oh, what might have been. Yes? Absolutely. And we're going to see some passages in a minute. That's a good point. We're going to see some passages in a minute that not only did they miss out, but they caused their children and their children's children to miss out. They missed out for generations because of choices that they made. The same holds true today. You have a family today that does not choose to remember God and obey God. Not only do those parents miss out, their children likely will miss out, their grandchildren will miss out, and it may continue for generations, where they will, none of them, be what they could have been. None of them will have what they could have had they been faithful to God. You see, our choices carry great consequences with them. What might have been. You look at the lives. Look at the lives of young people. Sometimes we can look at the life of a young man or a young woman, and we see them now that they're older, and we look at them and we think, what might have been? What potential they had to do great things for God. But it's what might have been. They didn't fulfill that. Sometimes we look at marriages and we say, what might have been? What could have been? God put these two people together. What could have been? Never realized. Sometimes we think of congregations. We think of elders, we think of preachers, we think of situations developing, we think about what might have been, could have been, but never realized. Oh, how sad it is to think that we may very well be missing out on the fullest blessings of God because we don't hear and obey Him as we ought to. Deuteronomy 5 and verse 29, if you look at a few passages, Deuteronomy recounts this more than any other book does. We'll notice a couple of verses from Deuteronomy. Remember that Deuteronomy is called the second law. It is the recounting of the law that God had given, the reminder of what has been. And so it's interesting that this book would use this expression a couple of times. In Deuteronomy 5 and verse 29, oh, that there were such an heart in them, that they would fear me and keep all my commandments always, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. God said, oh, that they had such a heart in them. Oh, that they had the heart that was in David. David was the man after God's own heart. What if everyone in that nation had had that heart? What if everyone had been like David? What could that nation have been if everyone in that nation had loved God the way that David did? If everyone in that nation had been as determined as David was to live for God. David wasn't perfect, we know that. But he is the man after God's own heart. What if everyone had had that kind of a heart? What would it have been like? Sometimes we make the statement, what if the whole church was like you? What if they attended as much as you attend? What if they gave as much as you give? What if they did as much as you do? What would the church be like? Would it double its work tomorrow? Or would it be out of work tomorrow? Would there be a full house every time the church meets for services, or would there be no one here? Or would you never know how many would be here based upon what you do as an individual? Oh, what might be if we truly would be what God wanted us to be. Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verses 29 and 30. Oh, that they were wise, that they understood this, that they would consider their latter end. How should one chase 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight, except that the rock had sold them and the Lord had shut them up? One chasing 1,000, two chasing 10,000. Notice, there are a couple of things that are interesting about this. First of all, one chasing 1,000 is interesting. But that's what the potential was. If they had obeyed God and listened to God, one could have put to flight 1,000. But what happens when you put two together? And two shall chase 2,000. Not what it says, is it? 2, 10,000. You ever thought about that? 1, 1,000, 2, 10,000. Here's what we can do individually, but here's what we can do collectively. We do more than double our efforts when we work together. We in our minds think, well, if we work together, we'll double what we're doing. Oh, no, you'll do much more than that. Two people working together will do more than either one of them could do individually. They will encourage, spur one another, help one another. Two shall chase 10,000. That's what the potential was had they lived for God. But think about Isaiah 48 and verse 18. One of the most beautiful verses in the Old Testament. Oh, that thou hast hearkened to my commandments, then had thy peace been as a river, and thy righteousness as the waves of the sea. God said if you'd just listened to my commandments, you would have had peace like a river. If you would have just listened to my commandments, your righteousness would have been like the waves of the sea. Have you ever stood on the seashore and watched the waves come in? Do they ever quit coming? No, just one. Now some are bigger than others, but they just keep coming. God said the blessings would have just kept coming. They would have been unending. If you had only hearkened, if you'd only listened to me, that's what your life could have been. Think about the song that we sometimes sing, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. What a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. Think about those two lines. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. Notice the beginning of those sentences. Oh, it's the same idea we have in this psalm. Oh, what peace we forfeit. Think about the peace that they forfeited. Think about the pain that they had to carry because they did not hearken or obey God. The same remains true in our lives. Jesus cried over Jerusalem. He said, I would have gathered thy children together as a hen gathers her chicks, but ye would not. Matthew 23 and verse 37. And then Luke 19, 41 and 42, he said, if thou hadst known. He said, if you could have only known what blessings were there awaiting you if you would just obey God. Tonight, through this psalm, we've been reminded that life can be greater than it is. That we do not have to one day look back and think about what might have been. We can think about what was if we will only listen to and obey God. Thank you very much for your attention tonight.